So, uh, hi, Sean.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
Okay. Yeah. So, Sean is a senior software developer who specializes in full stack development and software architecture. He manages teams of the developers as well as teaches many hundreds and thousands of, more how to create enterprise-ready applications, right? So, Sean's online courses have approximately that's 3 lakh or learners, largely because of his passion for development and his focus on helping people apply their programming skills in the real world. So he is a lifelong programmer and problem-solving addict whose goal is to like help people solve meaningful problems by mastering the art of software development. So, of course, please don't hesitate to get in touch with him later on about any opportunities or staying up to date with the upcoming technologies, right? So, Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's the end of my day here. It's almost 9 here, so it's getting to be my bedtime. But I decided it'd be a good idea to stay up and teach programming with everybody. It's a worthwhile thing to spend time doing. So, yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. So for me, it's like 6 a.m. in the morning. Like I just woke up.
I know when you emailed me about like good luck on your course tomorrow. I was like, wait, today, right? So it was here tomorrow.
Yeah.
So.
Time zones. So any tips for the community here before starting off with your talk?
Yeah, just tips in general, just general kind of.
Yeah, just general tips.
In general, don't be afraid to practice and code the same thing over, 10 times, to be honest. I mean, I know a lot of other programmers who do the same thing where, when you're figuring out a problem, something like that, you feel bad if you don't come up with the optimal solution the first time around. And that's generally not something that anybody is going to do. You're not going to get the optimal solution until probably the 20th or 30th or 100th time around. So, just don't be afraid to practice, and don't ever feel bad if the answer doesn't come to you right away, or if you make a so-called mistake, because you're working with the right medium, right? We're not working with clay here. We're not chiseling stone. We're working with pretty much the easiest thing to change, which is software. Right. So anyway, that would be my top advice, just in the career space.
Of course. Okay. So thank you for that answer, of course. And I'm sure that our viewers are really eager for your talk to start off. So let's just get started, right?
Yeah, awesome. Let's do that. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. Let me just go. All right. So I got some slides here to start off. And what we're going to be doing here basically is taking a look at how to implement something called optimistic UI using Redux. So all right. Can everybody see my screen now? All right. Cool. So basically what we're going to be doing here is, as I said, building starting off with a basic Redux application. And you can find that, if you want to kind of follow along with the code here, by searching for this GitHub repo here. That's my GitHub username. So SHAUNWA. And the repo is called Optimistic Redux. So it's got 2 basic commits. The first one, which we're going to be starting off with today, is the non-optimistic. This is basically the application without the optimistic UI. Basically all the starting code. I just used create React app basically to generate this with a Redux template. So feel free to just search for that. It's can't even spell my own name. SHAUNWA Optimistic Redux. And you can just feel free to clone that And that will give you the finished code. If you want the starting code, you're just going to want to copy this git hash here, and inside your GitHub repo, once you've cloned it, you can just do git checkout and paste that commit hash, and you'll have that code at the starting state that I'm going to be using. That's all if you want to follow along. If you don't want to, that's all right too. Let's go to the first slide here. So what we're going to be learning today, I've already talked about the basic thing of what we're going to be doing, but we're going to be starting off with learning what an optimistic UI is, right? What does that term really mean for those of you who don't know? Some of you might already be familiar with it. And then once we've learned a little bit of background about that, we're going to actually see how to implement it using Redux. And just throughout that, we're going to be talking about some best practices. So it should be short and sweet, good kind of thing for to get everyone on the same page. So the first question that many people have when they're first, when they hear me say something about Redux, like, oh yeah, you can do this with Redux, or you can do that with Redux. They always ask, oh, but can you do it also with context, or can you do that also with MobX, or can you do that also with just regular use state hook? And the answer to all of those is absolutely you can. It's going to be different, and some of them are going to be better than others, or some of them are going to be a little more difficult to do this with than others. But in general, it's all of them are going to work for the basic concepts that we're going to be seeing here. So yes, you can. I mean, the technologies are going to be different. The basic, the actual code is going to obviously vary quite a bit, but the general overarching concepts are going to be pretty much the same. So let's first start off here by taking a look at what optimistic UI is. The general definition of this, just kind of that I think of, is when inside our apps, we give the user the impression that something has actually happened, right? That some change has been actually made throughout the full stack, right, on the database, etc., before it's actually happened. All right, so just some examples of what this might look like. You've almost definitely seen some of these. Many of you see all of these ones on a daily basis. There's a lot of examples of this optimistic UI in software that we use every day, right? So the first, just kind of going, I guess, clockwise from the top left here. That first one there in the top left is iMessage. Basically what happens, as many of you know, and I would assume Android does this as well, is that when you send a message to somebody through iMessage, I would assume that also applies for WhatsApp or WeChat, any other chat application. When you send a message, that message automatically appears directly in your chat history. However, as many of you have noticed, when you try and when you send a text and let's say you don't have service, you check back maybe a few minutes later and you see, oh, hey, that message actually failed. So that is an example there of optimistic UI, where it looks like that message was actually sent when in reality it was still in the process of sending and maybe it even failed. And of course, you see this same kind of thing in plenty of other applications as well. Doing things like liking posts on Facebook and even posting on Facebook is something that is generally done optimistically, right? So, when you give that little thumbs up to somebody's post, even though it looks like you reacted immediately to that, in general, it may have actually happened. That request may have actually happened, a few seconds after that. And the same is true with Twitter. Twitter actually takes us to another level, and we're not going to be going quite that far today. But Twitter actually takes us to another level where you can tweet. You can think you're tweeting when you're on a subway or something like that with no service whatsoever. And it just kind of stores that and waits until you have service again, and then it actually sends, makes those tweets. And the final one down in the bottom left here is something that I actually noticed earlier today. This is actually a screenshot from my inbox that allows you to undo sending messages in email, which I thought was actually quite interesting until I thought, wait a minute, they're just waiting a few seconds to actually send my email, so that if I send, a nasty email to somebody and then I immediately regret it, I can click undo and it won't actually ever send that email. So these kind of things are just some basic examples of what optimistic UI generally looks like in the context of different applications. So the next question you might have is, well, isn't that lying, right? Is that a good idea to actually lie to our users like that by making them think that something's happened when it hasn't actually happened yet, right? When there's a chance that it will fail, let's say. And the answer to that is mostly no, right? Most of the time, the reason that this is generally an okay thing to do and isn't going to lead to a bad user experience is that, in the vast majority of situations, most likely more than 99% of situations, whatever request your application is trying to make is going to be successful, right? And if you think of the alternative, which is showing, a little spinner or something like that, a loading message for a few seconds, that's generally going to make the user experience worse than, like the example I gave with iMessage, where a user might think that they've sent that message until a few seconds later, a few minutes later, when they actually get that error message saying, hey, we weren't able to send this for you. So just kind of relying on that statistic there, and I absolutely made up that number. I don't know that it's 99%. Depending on where you live, if you live way out in the country, it may well be less than that. But the fact is that most of the time, these things are going to be successful. So from a user interface perspective, we want to make sure that it's generally pretty safe to assume that our requests or whatever the user is trying to do is going to succeed. And the next question then is, what about when something actually does fail, right? What about if if a user wants to post a tweet, right? If the user wants to react to something on Facebook, well, generally the way we handle that is simply by telling them, right? This again is from iMessage. That's the little thing you'll see when something isn't delivered, and usually what happens then is you can just click on it and it'll give you the option to try sending it again. Cool. So those are the basic concepts of optimistic UI in just general non-technologically specific terms. So what we're going to do now is take a look at how to actually implement this in a React Redux application. So if you copied this GitHub repo from before, what you're going to want to do, you'll see that it has two directories inside of that, a backend and a front-end directory, and those obviously correspond to the front end and back end. If you want to run this, you'll want to open up a terminal in both the front end and the back end directories. Oops, let me just open that up there. Oh, here, I had that in the front end already. All right, and then in order to run it, you're going to want to run the command npm run start in the front end, and on the back end, you're going to run the command npm. Oops, it just opened up in another window here. On the back end, you're going to run the command npm run dev. Right, and I'll show you what that looks like. It's not the most exciting looking application out there, but it does work. All right, so let me just drag that over and I'll show you what it looks like. There we go. Cool, so this is what our wonderful, what our wonderful, very stylish, the latest user interface application looks like. You can add to-dos, something like buy groceries. All right, and submit that. And obviously, it will add that to the to-do list. You can add something else. Learn Redux. Submit it, and it'll add it to that. You can also click complete to mark these things as completed and delete them if you want to get rid of them. So super simple application. It's just a good kind of jumping off point for learning about how to actually make this UI optimistic. So feel free to look through these repos too, because there is quite a bit of code. I'll just very briefly explain some of the key points here to you. So in the back end, it's just got a single server file. It's not anything, I wanted it to be easy to run, so it doesn't actually use a database. It just uses an in-memory array to store our to-dos. And it's got endpoints for loading to-dos, for creating to-dos, for marking them as completed, and for deleting the to-dos. So that's the back end. It's really nothing too out of the ordinary. I trust that most of you would be able to figure it out, even if you're not familiar with Express or Node.js. And then just taking a look at the front end. So first of all, I have this already set up with Redux, and obviously I have all of these actions working on the front end. Let me just reorganize that here. So all of that's working so far, and feel free to take a look through this. I'm just going to walk you through each of these files very briefly. So in the actions file here, we have all of our to-do action types and all of the action creators. Now, one question you're probably going to have here is, well, it's going to be more of a comment than a question. It's going to be, wow, looks like a lot of repeated code. Absolutely. It would be absolutely possible to just create code that generates all these variations for you. But the important thing here is that each of our actions has a loading state, right? That's after the action is actually initiated. So when we create a new to-do, when we're waiting for that server request to complete, we're going to get, we're basically going to dispatch an action with this type. And when it completes, if it's successful, we're going to see this success action happen. If it's not, we're going to see this failure action. And then down here, we just have all of the different action creators with the payloads. And then we have our components, right? So we have a new to-do form. That's just this thing up at the top. We have a to-do list component, very simple, just displays a lot of to-do items. And the to-do list item is here. It's just got the basic logic for displaying the text, whether or not something's completed, and the buttons for changing the state of a to-do item. Okay, and each of these also just dispatches the corresponding actions. So as it stands right now, well, and of course we also have our reducers here, which currently there is an error reducer, which just takes care of any errors, displaying any errors that have occurred. And we have a to-dos reducer, which takes care of managing that to-dos state in the Redux store. Other than that, we just have some simple selectors. We have some thunks that take care of actually making the requests to the server. So we have load to-dos, create to-do, mark to-do as completed, delete to-do. Those are the things that are dispatched by the various buttons in the application. Yeah, and that's about it. So as it stands right now, our front-end application is pretty, it's not very, it looks like it works well from our point of view, right? Because currently we're running both the front end and the back end on, locally, right? So any request here, like when we create a to-do, for example, and submit it, right? It looks like it's happening pretty much instantaneously. However, it's not, and this is generally, it's generally not something that will obviously happen in the real world. So in order to mimic more of what might happen to our app in the wild, I have this app.use thing, which basically just inserts a 2-second delay into any request that comes through our server. So if you uncomment that and save it, the server should refresh, and we can see what this is actually going to look like. So we're gonna have to recreate our to-dos because because obviously it refreshes that in-memory array. But this will give us a good chance to see when we submit something now, it's going to take 2 seconds, and there we go. It actually appears. So our application right now, the point here is that it's currently not optimistic. So what we're going to want to do is make it so that before the server, before the request is actually completed, our application already makes the user think, right? Our application already appears as if that's completed. So let's take a look at how to actually make these changes to our application so that even with a 2-second delay, the user experience will seem like everything's happening instantaneously. The main changes are going to be made to the to-dos reducer. All right, so we're going to be making most of the changes to this thing here. And let me just pull up my notes here so that I can make sure I'm doing the right thing. So when we're implementing optimistic UI using Redux or using any other kind of state management tool for that matter, generally what we're going to want to do is, if you look at this to-dos reducer, you'll see that it's really only responding to the success events, right? To the success actions in our application, right? So load to-dos success, that actually updates the state to have the to-dos that we loaded from the server. Same thing for create to-dos, marking to-dos as completed, deleting them, etc. Right? But none of those is actually going to happen until our server request completes successfully. So what we're going to want to do is kind of modify this reducer a little bit so that instead of paying attention primarily to the success actions, it's going to actually listen for, well, not listen for so much as just react to the loading events instead of the success events, okay? So in other words, whenever one of these loading events occurs, and if you look at the thunks here, you'll see that those all occur when any of these Redux, when any of these thunks is first dispatched, right? So when we start loading to-dos, we dispatch this load to-dos loading action. When we create to-dos, we dispatch this create to-do loading action here. Same for marking to-dos as completed and deleting them. So we're going to want to kind of tap into that action and make that kind of the primary place where we update the to-dos in our store. So what this is going to look like, we'll just kind of go through this as I have it in my notes, not in any particular order so much. Let's see here. All right. So the first thing is for creating to-dos. So for creating to-dos, well, just loading to-dos is pretty much going to stay the same in optimistic UI. There's not really a whole lot we can do to speed that up, although if you wanted to incorporate some kind of skeleton loading thing, right, like how Facebook or Slack shows just the gray lines across while content is loading, you could do that here. But we're going to start with the create to-do part here. And basically, what we're going to want to do is add a case for the create to-do loading action. And when that action happens, we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we were doing before inside our create to-do success, our create to-do success action case here. So we're going to basically get the new to-do text from the payload. Right, and you can take a look at the actions here if you want to see how that's all structured. The payload is going to be the new to-do text. And what we're going to do is basically optimistically add a new to-do to the store, right? So we're going to be concatenating on a new to-do to our to-dos array in the Redux store. And that's just going to look like this. It kind of expects our to-dos to have an ID, so we're just going to give it an ID of new. The text here is just going to be the new to-do text that we have on the action payload. And we're going to start it off with is completed as false, which is just kind of going to be the default for this, for our new to-dos that we create. All right. And then for the success, basically what we're going to do in the create to do success is we're going to basically just remove this new to do that we added onto here optimistically and replace it with the actual new to do that we got from the server, right? The server just generates a unique ID. If we take a look at it up here, right? It generates a unique ID, so we want to make sure that we have that correctly in the state. So what that's going to look like, and I'm just kind of typing from my notes here, is we're going to basically filter out this new optimistic to-do from our state. So we're going to say filter, and we only want the to-dos whose ID is not equal to new. That's kind of our little hack for getting rid of the optimistic one. And we're just going to concatenate on the actual new to-do that we got back from the server. All right. So if we take a look at this already, just from that simple change, and I think that's the only one that we have to make there. Let's take a look here. So our server is still got that 2-second delay. So if we refresh this, and it's got a 2-second delay for this loading as well. But now if we go to actually add a new to-do, something like add optimism, something like that, and submit it, we're going to see that that appears, and it looks like it's almost instantaneous, even though if we inspect this and take a look at the Redux store, here, let me just commit that and add another one, and click submit, we're going to see that the actual success action doesn't happen. Oh, and I guess you couldn't see that happen. Let me try one more. I'm just going to delete this here so that we can see it happening. Just commit that, submit it. We're going to see that the success thing doesn't actually happen until well after this thing has already appeared in our Redux store, right? So that is what we want to do for creating to-dos. And depending on how much time I have left here, I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to show you how to do all of these. But the other thing that I want to touch on is what to do, how to have our reducer handle the case where it fails. Okay, so in the case where, let's say our create to-do request fails, well, in that case, we have to kind of roll the state back, right? We have to remove this optimistic to-do that we added because, you know, it's at that point, at the point in time where, in the case where our create to-do request fails, this new to-do is actually a lie, right? Because that doesn't represent the actual data that's on the server. So in that case, we're going to have to roll it back. So we're going to add a case here that's basically create to-do failure. And in that case, all we have to do is simply remove this to-do using a little trick here. Pretty much the same one as we used here. We're just going to, so the create to-do failure action is going to have in its payload the ID of the to-do, the ID of the to-do that was, that basically failed, right? So we're going to say something like const to-do ID equals action dot payload dot to do ID. Again, if I might actually have to take a look at how that's structured here. So for creating that's just going to contain the info of the to do. And so this is going to look like, oh, you know what? We just want to actually do the same exact thing that we did here. We want to just remove the one with the new ID from our store. All right. So in the case that it fails, which we can simulate here by just sort of commenting out all of this code here and sending a status of 500, right? We'll see if we try and add a new to-do now. And here we're going to have to refresh it. That's going to wipe away all our current to-dos. So let's just add one here. Something. All right. Let's wait for the Okay, so we see that when we try and create a to-do, it shows up, and then it disappears when our application sees that it failed. Now, that's obviously just one way to handle it. You could also, if you wanted to handle that by keeping the to-do and just displaying a red outline around it, right? Sort of like iMessage does. Or if you wanted to kind of gray it out, if you wanted to basically add some kind of interface indication that shows that that request failed, that's basically what you could do. So the one more thing that I want to show you here. Let's see. So we're going to basically just comment all that out. Oh, actually, before we do that, that's what I wanted to do. Another thing that we'd want to do, right? Obviously, if the user were to enter something here and submit it, and then it just kind of disappeared with no explanation, that obviously wouldn't be ideal either, because they're like, okay, this doesn't mean anything to me, and my to-do just left. So generally, you'll want to make it a little more obvious. Like I think that most phone applications will give you some kind of push notification that says, hey, this thing you were trying to do didn't work. So if you want to do that, all you would have to do is just add that to your thunk, right? So you could, before you actually dispatch the failure event. Oh, here, we want that in the create to do actually. Before you actually dispatch that failure event, you could do something like, I don't know, if you wanted to display if you wanted to just display an alert, right? You could just say alert, something like, sorry, we weren't able to create a to-do. Please try again, something like that, right? Again, you could obviously improve the user experience there to make it a little more helpful. And you could also actually not delete the to-do from the state like we're doing, right? You could have it so that the user could retry. Maybe you'd give it a retry button. But whatever the case, now if we do this, what it's going to look like, we submit it, we're going to get a nice alert that tells us that something went wrong, right? And obviously that pauses the main thread. So alerts generally aren't the most user-friendly things around, but for this for our purposes here, it's not too bad. So it looks like, how much time do I have left? Looks like I've got about 5 minutes left, right? So what else did I want to show you? So I wanted to show you, besides that, some other things that you could do to basically, I mentioned that you might be able to, instead of removing the to-do from the reducer here, right? You might want to, if it fails, display something that's actually helpful, right? So that the user can retry that request. And in that case, what you would want to do is probably something more like this. So what you could do is, instead of just removing it completely, you could actually add something back on with an indicator that it failed, right? So you're still kind of preserving that data there. And here, what's this going to look like? Do ID. You'd have to probably change the action, the failure action. Oh, we already have that. So we could just get the payload there. We could get the new to-do text. I believe that's what it is. Oh, I called it info there, but yeah, we could get the new to-do text there. If that failed, and let me just actually take a look at the thunk here to make sure that's what we're doing. Yeah, if it fails, we're just doing the text there. So we'll get that from the payload, and we would have it there. And then we could just add basically an indicator to our to-do, saying something like, is failure. You could make that be failed also, something like that. And you can just make that true. And then inside the actions, or no, not inside the actions, inside the to-do list item component, basically what you do is you would just have a different, sort of a different interface that you display, right? So you'd do something like change the styling, right? Maybe something like, what would we do here? Something like background, add a background color, something like that. Background color. And then you would basically just check if the to-do is a failure, right? And then if it is, you could make that background color like, I don't know, a terrible bright red color like that. Otherwise, you know, you would just kind of display it as white or whatever. So let's see if that actually works. Try doing something like that. Oh, so it did delete it again. Hang on a minute. It should. To do failure, it should concatenate that on. Oh, there we go. So that's going to be dot to do. Let me actually change that in here from to do info to do. I'm just going to change that to new to do text. That'll be easier, right? And then we'll make that new to do text and new to do text. All right, so let's see if we can make that work now. I'm just going to refresh this, make sure we're all good, and we'll add something, submit it. And in this case, we wouldn't even have to have that. But yeah, we see that now it displays that terrible red thing, that terrible red background, which obviously we'd want to change the styling for. And you know, what we'd be able to do then is actually display like a retry button on the to-do list item. So we could do something like to-do.isFailure. And if it's a failure, then what we would want to do is just display a button that allows them to actually try and create that to-do over again. So let's see here, what would that look like? We'd have a button like this. Button, and on click, what that would do is it would dispatch the create to-do thunk with the text from the to-do as the payload. And it would say, we'd say something like retry. We'd probably also want to hide these other buttons if it failed. So we could just do what we could even do. Say if it's a failure, display that. Otherwise, you can display these two buttons, and then we'll wrap those in a fragment like that. And we have to import the create to do thunk as well. So let's see if we can make that work, right? If we refresh, well, I won't be able to demonstrate that because our server kind of requires every time we restart our server, in other words, every time we make a change, it'll sort of wipe our to-dos away. But basically that should actually, that would actually retry that action for you. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover here. Obviously, there are many more actions to make to sort of optimify. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what the verb is for that, but there are plenty more. And if you want to see what those look like, just feel free to take a look again at this GitHub repo. The final version of that contains all of the up-to-date code for all of the solutions basically for implementing those things. So if you take a look at the reducers here, you'll see that it's got all of the code for marking to-dos as completed, all that kind of stuff. Cool. So thank you so much for listening. That's about all I've got. If you're interested in getting in touch with me here, probably the best way to do so is to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search me by my name, and you should be able to find me here. So that's about all I got. Yeah, just feel free to send me a network request, and if you have any questions, anything else I can help you with, feel free to reach out. So anyway, that's all I've got for you guys. Again, thank you so much. And that's about it.